Hello, I'm Warren Danskin, a member of the Boston Avenue History and Archives Committee, chaired by John Bradley. This is March 20, 2019, and time for another of our oral history interviews. Photographers are very fond of the Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. They shoot from all angles, and the church often appears in the newspapers and in magazines. Its architecture and our congregational life attract a steady stream of visitors from near and far. Today, we'll hear some stories about how this magnificent structure was designed. Our guest is Teresa Holder. Welcome, Teresa. Tell us about your educational background.
I graduated from Central High School here in Tulsa and went to Oklahoma State University, where I received my first degree. I have a BFA in the studio arts. It was illustration and watercolor. And then I have my master's in museum studies from the University of Oklahoma.
You keep a busy schedule. What's your current occupation?
Currently, I am the gallery director of the Gardiner Art Gallery at Oklahoma State University in the Department of Art.
You have an interesting connection to this church. Would you tell us about that?
My father is a Methodist minister. We started out as all Methodists are. They're transferred all over the state, so I've lived all over Oklahoma. But he was transferred here to Boston Avenue during my senior year of high school. It was 1973, 1974. So I kind of grew up a little bit up in the towers.
So you're a PK. And,
yes, it's Reverend William Gordon Spencer and Marilyn Spencer.
Thank you. And Miss Ada is certainly a heroine in this congregation. And we have her photo, and her name is certainly revered. Now, in your project, how has Miss Ada, and what is her full name?
Ada Matilda Robinson.
And how has what kind of a role has she played in this project?
Well, just kept backing up just a little bit. My interest came from, as a child, my mother always pointing out that Ada had created this building, Ada Robinson. And when I became a student at the university, in the arts, I found that all the instructors in the art history classes, etc., give the credit to Bruce Goff as the designer of the church. And I would have a lot of discussions with these professors, like, why are you promoting that when the church gives credit to Ada Robinson? So that brought a lot of lively discussions at home when I'd come home on the weekends and we would talk about it. And then my daughters as students had the same experience. So you wouldn't believe what I heard in art history class today. And we had a speaker a few years back come in on Bruce Goff, and one of the very first things that she said was that no reputable researcher would give any credit to the concept that Ada had designed the church, that she was just an art teacher. And that kind of spurred my interest, well, now I want to know, what is the story? And so that kind of started my quest, and it's not just what is the church's story, but what is Bruce's or that side of the story. So I've done a ton of research looking at both sides, and it's really a fascinating story. It's quite complicated, but most definitely Ada was the creative mind behind everything we see here. She was in complete control.
And your scholarly interest has been piqued, and it's taken you pretty far. Didn't you have to do some research in other cities as well?
Yes, I've tried not to leave any stones unturned. I've sent a proxy researcher to the Smithsonian, who has a copy of Robert Garrison. Robert Garrison executed the sculptures on the church. and in the church. And he has a scrapbook in the Smithsonian, so I hired a woman to go in and document that, just loose photographs for me, because I wanted to know what was in that, were there any clues in there. And I have been to the Chicago Art Institute a couple of times. I'm getting ready to make another trip up there this summer. And they have all of Bruce's estate. And that, they have all the architectural drawings and the architectural side of their collection. And then they have recordings and letters and photographs and even his report cards when he was a student here in the library there at the Art Institute. So I've been up there a few times looking through everything they have as well.
What will be the end goal? Will you perhaps write a book or write a dissertation, or do you have something in mind?
I do want to put it all together. What I've learned, there's already been a great book on Ada Robinson. There's a great book on the church. There's some really great books on Bruce Goff as well. So I would like to put something together that's kind of showing both sides and my take on kind of looking at some of these details that people are not really, these stones people are not really turning over, like why, the whys and why, not just the whys, but like the very first article that was written giving Bruce credit was actually written by his best friend, and the man had only been in the church one time. But it was always referred to, look what this article said, when there's really not any authority to it.
So if there's a storyline, who are your principal characters then? Just review that.
There's a lot. There's Reverend Rice, there's the minister at that time, there's C.C. Cole, he was the head of the building committee, and Ada Robinson. You have Rush, Endicott and Rush, which are the architectural firm, and especially a couple of those people in Endicott, and of course Bruce. And then there's Alfonso Iannelli. He was a sculptor from Chicago that befriended. He became very good friends with Bruce during the construction of the church, and he was the one that wrote the first article. But he really there were a lot of letters between Bruce and Alfonso, where Bruce has written him and vice versa. And there's a lot of clues in those letters. And there are other characters in there. There's a lot of fascinating side stories too that are easy to kind of get off on. Oh, this is so fascinating.
Well, as I hear you speak, I could envision a film version of this. Well, if you did have a film version, or when you get your story where you want it, would Miss Ada be the heroine? Because she's our heroine here at the church.
Ada is, when you study her history and you really get into depth on it, because who was Ada, when she's referred to as just an art teacher, and going back when she was a young child and growing up in Richmond, Indiana, and she was often ill, starting from childhood, but she always worked her way through it. She missed her graduation, from illness, and people made all these allowances, but because of her illness, she was homeschooled, and her father gave her a lot of art, made arrangements for art lessons, so she was being exposed to art at a very young age, and her early exposure really shaped the way she thought, I believe, the rest of her life, in promoting the local, promoting your own, and not just looking outwardsly, like we didn't look to Europe for the design of the church here. It's very Oklahoma born. And she promoted her own. She promoted her own students. She promoted local artists. But her early education, you can see, shaped things as she came to Oklahoma, moved to Oklahoma City. Both her and her brother got typhoid fever after moving here. When they were kind of ill when they moved here, her brother, they moved here because of his illness. And then they get typhoid fever, both of them. Her brother passes away, and somehow Ada survives. But, she, within a year of survival, of that horrible illness, she is starting to teach. She's exhibiting her art. She's, and within a matter, just a few years, she is teaching in a public school. She's head of the Arts Federation in Oklahoma City, going all over the state, educating people on the arts, giving lectures, and she's also creating her own work, and she's giving lessons. And that's just, for me, when I think about what I do, and I think, well, how did she do this, and this, and this, and this, and this, all of this at the same time, when, the communication, the transportation, and she was just all over the place. But I do think it also shows that she would work herself to exhaustion. Quite often she would work herself to exhaustion, but then her spirit would get her going again, on something else that she's very interested in.
I'd be curious, what would it be like to know her as a person? Do you get any reflections on, was she soft-spoken? Was she outgoing? Was she inspirational? Do you have any feeling for what it would be like just to know Miss Ada?
I think that's, I don't know that I've got a well enough sense of her that way. I don't think she was soft-spoken. I think her sense, because she was well, in some ways, I guess there's a balance there, because she was criticized a lot for not defending herself in that situation when there became that controversy later. She didn't defend herself, she did, but it's kind of somewhat more privately, a one-on-one when needed for legal reasons. But she didn't publicly go out in the newspaper or write letters like Bruce Goff did. But because of her ability to speak in public, and I've heard one of her lectures, someone had recorded one of her presentations, and it was really interesting hearing her voice. And so I think that she was really loved. I know that anybody that was around her that referred to her as very much a lady, 100% a lady, very, without a description of what that actually means, but that was one way she was described. I know that she was extremely highly respected from the earliest years. I think sometimes that gets lost as new generations come along and they don't really know what this person's experience and what they're bringing to the table. And there is a document that survived it was in what they call the century chest, and you can look that up. The Oklahoma Historical Society has it. But in one of their letters to the Future Art Museum, they talk about how they needed a leader. They needed a Moses. They needed someone that was going to guide them in the arts into the future. How are they going to build, arts education, and how are they going to build an art museum? And then later in that letter, they said they found that Moses, and they found it in Ada Robinson. And so they created a position for her to guide them in the future. It's a really fascinating document. And then to see what she did in that position in the state. She went around, the first exhibitions in the state of Oklahoma were curated by Ada, and she organized what they called they had those lantern, can't recall what they call it right now, but magic lantern, where they would do the projections. She went around to schools and did she said she exposed over 6,000 children to art. So that would have been more for what we think of as our classical arts. But she also started organizing local art. She organized an exhibition of her own student work, just to show what can be done under good guidance, which would have been her. But I think some of the interesting stories beyond, the lectures, she gave dozens and dozens of well-documented lectures across the state. and out of state. And then giving these private lessons for this organization. She was giving lessons, and then creating her own work and exhibiting it, and curating exhibitions. But when she taught we have Central High School here, and they had Central High School in Oklahoma City. When she was teaching in Oklahoma City, and this is just an interesting kind of fun side story. When, this was kind of post-war, or World War I, and so supplies and money were a little bit tighter, but the theater production at their school, we don't have it in our schools today as much as they used to then, but when they needed the stage props, Ada said, my class can do it. She got her class and some other classes together, and they did all the paintings, and there's a really good article that ended up in one of the papers down there on how she pulled this all together and how amazing it was with the process they went through by stripping the old backdrops, all the fabric, and repainting, and how it made it look like it was all done by one artist instead of all these different students. So they created all these props, and her right-hand student at that time was a young man named Arnold Gillespie. And Arnold went on to Hollywood and became a special effects person. And one of his films was The Wizard of Oz. And, got all these awards for his special effects in Wizard of Oz, and sometimes I wonder, what if Ada had not volunteered her students to create this stage play? Would that young student have been inspired by working in theater? And what would all of us that grew up on The Wizard of Oz, how different would that be?
The ripple effect.
Yeah, the ripple effect.
Oh my.
And that's just one of, many stories out there of some of her students and inspiration. And even Robert Garrison, the young man that did the sculpture, he was so into his art as a student that he didn't care about any of his other classes. He felt like they were a waste of time, and because of that, they didn't graduate him. But Ada went to his parents and said, don't give up on him. He is so talented, don't give up on him, even though school basically has. And they sent him on to one art school that he dropped out of because he just wanted to focus on the art. He wasn't interested in like what we call the general education classes. He didn't think they were worth his time. But he went on to do some great things besides Boston Avenue and before Boston Avenue. He worked with the man that interned or apprenticed under the man that did Mount Rushmore.
That's an amazing account.
And you think if Ada hadn't pushed him and talked to his parents, don't give up on this boy.
Yeah, it's just kind of the dream story of an effective teacher.
Yes.
And the implications of it. It should be an inspiration to teachers everywhere, really,
Yes.
to hear the story.
And, one of the things a lot of people are really not aware of is Ada, and it started in Oklahoma City, taught, not only the art classes, but art appreciation. So she started these art appreciation classes. For the girls, it was focused a little bit more on the homemaking, but for the young men, it was architecture. And so, because she felt that young people they're the future, and they are the future everything. The women being the future homemakers or business women, but the boys are the future businessmen of our state. This was, of course, the 19-teens. And 1917, 1918 is when she's in Oklahoma City.
What was her lifespan, approximately?
She was born in the, I can't quite remember, I think in the 1980 something, late 80s, and she died in 1880s and died in the 1960s.
I see.
I don't have the exact date on that.
Was there some relationship with University of Tulsa?
Yes, when she was working on the church here, she got an offer to develop the art department at Tulsa University. So, and then she stayed there for quite some time. She was there about to the 40s, I believe.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, you have alerted us to, or alluded to, the quote-unquote controversy. And I just wondered if you could kind of put that into perspective for us. I think a lot of people hear it. Some people still feel very strongly one way or the other, but you've really gotten into it up to your elbows.
Yes.
So I'd be really interested to hear your sort of, I guess, basic outline of how you see the controversy, who the players were, and what the various positions seem to be.
Well, it is, I think, quite complicated. The church's story has been the same and steady, and everything points that I can find, even though there's some documentation missing, there's a lot of documentation that really supports everything the church says. So you have C.C. Cole, the head of the building committee, and Ada Robinson, and all the documents that have survived time show they were in charge of everything. There wasn't anything that wasn't done in the church from, I was reading yesterday some articles on the glass, the windows, and the company that does the brass, the hinged windows here in church, which is a little different from the stained glass. So that's two different companies, but I mean, the Jacoby Glass of St. Louis still did these hinged windows, but you had a company doing the hinged windows. So you have a lot of players. But it was kind of pre-Depression, and Bruce is working as a draftsman for Rush and Cotton Rush.
And Bruce being?
Bruce Goff.
Thank you.
Yes, Bruce Goff. And he was a former student of Ada's, and she worked with him before. And, of course, this is a teacher-student relationship. But she, as was her nature, she pushed her own. So she pushed her own students like she did Arnold Gillespie, like she did Robert Garrison to do the sculpture as a former student, as she did, Bruce Goff. She went to the building committee and promoted Bruce because she felt like Bruce would understand her, that Bruce did understand her. They communicated well, so she could give him her ideas easily. All the very first articles, their contracts with Ada were signed the exact same day that the contracts with the building committee, and one of the, and there's going to be access where people can read all the details on that. But one of the things they said is that Ada would represent the church in all matters. And I think she did that. She did represent the church in all matters, because even working with C.C. Cole, C.C.'s writing her on everything. This is happening with the stained glass. This is happening with the organ. This is happening with the atrium. All the hinges, the door frames, the light fixtures, the kitchen. All these letters that have survived time, he's stating her, but he's also saying, please advise. So he was also asking for her advice, and there wasn't anything that didn't go by past Ada for its approval. And you can even see that in the hall. If you look really closely at the blueprints, up in small print, it will say needs approval. So some of the, especially the sculptural or artistic pieces. But somewhere along the line, and the very first articles, the day after the contract was signed, the very first articles come out and they say, they may have had Bruce's name, dream of a young man. But they will say that Ada's vision comes alive through the pencil of her student. Something that's really close to what I said. And that's repeated in all of the first articles, that this is Ada's vision and Bruce is helping to execute it as a draftsman for Rush into Cotton Rush. There's a complication in that, Ada wasn't an architect. It was a time that the state was starting to require licenses and training to get an architecture license, and existing architects could apply. Ada applied, Bruce later applied. He was apprenticing under, there where he's working. But working with Rush, Endicott, and Rush, Endicott didn't like working with Ada. He didn't like working with a woman, I don't believe. And some of the stories, is that Mr. Cole had to act as a mediator, and they quit meeting at the architect's office because things got so contentious, and they started meeting in his office where he could kind of act as a mediator. It was a place where Ada felt a little safer, and Ada offered to back out once. She said, this is, getting, and they actually offered her, redid her contract and offered her more money because she was a lot more involved than they originally envisioned. But somewhere along the line, Bruce, in the architectural firm, this is the architectural firm, and you have the designing architect, who is the head of the project. And Bruce was the head of the project because that's who Ada was communicating with. Endicott was running for water commissioner. Mr. Rush had retired. He worked just a little bit on the project and retired. And so it was Bruce and the rest of the team at Rush, Endicott, and Rush. But when his friend, as it got towards the end, I think that, things were getting over. It was, I think, a stressful project because they were trying to get it done a certain amount of time. I think some things happened. Ada was sick. She was sick a couple of times during the construction. She was hospitalized at one time, so things were still being done. Things were still having to be done. And so they were consulting her in her hospital bed. They were consulting her during her recovery at home. She ended up staying with the Coles to be closer during some of her recovery. And when she was able to get back up on her feet was during the construction of the sanctuary. And when she came in, it was described as the balcony having these railings of turnstiles, and the quote was architectural knobs and drippings. And Ada was very upset. This is not, as she put it, not a theater. Said that she often had to remind Bruce it wasn't a theater, that everything focused on the word. And so they said she sat down that day and redesigned the balcony. If you go in there today, there's no ornament on the balcony edge. It's just nice and smooth. And that's to keep the focus off of it. But Bruce wrote, there was a letter that Bruce wrote to his friend in Chicago, Alfonso. And Alfonso apparently had criticized a sketch that Bruce had sent him on the top of the sanctuary. And apparently Alfonso had quite a bit of criticism about it. And Bruce was defending it and saying, well, it was sketched quickly. I don't pay much attention to drawings. I just pay attention to building. And he said, but it doesn't matter because it will never happen anyway, because Ada has taken me off. I will have nothing to do with the rest of the church. And I'm sure basically he said it was going to be a disaster. And I felt like when she came out of the hospital and found this ornament, and there's a few other things around the church that I know that she redid. And I think there were a lot of details that were, not that she didn't approve of. And I think that because of the speed it was being built, some little things happened. Like a staircase coming out instead of straight, she came back and made sure it's curved so it's a little bit more fluid. But I think that was the beginning. We add the tension with Endicott. Bruce had just married, recently married, and some people think that added to it. I don't think that added to it. I think it was Ada becoming upset with what he, some of his designs in the church and pulling him off of that, and his resentment, because we will see it in a lot of his letters later. It's so bad. And he was referring to things that the church are getting so bad. And I think he really was upset that he no longer had any part, especially and then even the architect firm said they had nothing to do with the treatment of the interior. And then right after the church was finished, it was getting so much publicity. And, and it was all going to Ada. And then most of them didn't mention Bruce. And the early articles would mention Bruce, but most of them, occasionally you'd see his name as, with the architect firm, but most of them were in praise of C.C. Cole and Ada Robinson, and those two were the two that really oversaw everything. And so it was really, they're the ones that really pulled it together, kept everything going. But right after the church was, I think it was dedicated in the summer, and in that fall, the people that were so interested in the church, they were wanting to write articles, a lot of different magazines and newspapers. The ones that seemed to contact the church got the story right. The ones that contacted the architecture firm were getting their information from Bruce. The very first article that, and Bruce, of course, it was a lot of hard work for the young man. He was young when this is happening, and I just can't even imagine a 23-year-old even drafting this, even with the guidance. And, he had some vision, but his work prior to this was very different. So I can't imagine the work that took, but the very first article that came out was an architectural record, and it was written by his good friend Alfonso Iannelli. And in that article, there are letters that support it where even Bruce is correcting Alfonso. Alfonso, make sure you only put elevator, because there's only one elevator. Alfonso had only been to the church one time, and so he'd only saw it once during the construction. So everything else he knew was what Bruce told him from a distance, because he was in Chicago. But Bruce asked him, at this time you could feel the tension, that Bruce was definitely angry with Ada, and he wanted that title as the designing architect, which, an architectural firm, as I stated before, you have the firm and then you have the designing architect. So he wanted that title. Money was starting to get tight. He needed the accolades to promote his own career. Ada she was already, she was at TU at this time. She hadn't established, her reputation was established. But that very first article was kind of this snowball, because Alfonso wrote in that article, it was a nice article, on the construction of the church, but he writes all about the church, and then he just says that the church should have credit for hiring Ada to make the suggestion to hire Bruce. And and then they said, and they want to credit her for the interior color. And that's, so they downplayed her to, again, an art teacher, as if that's the only thing she ever did. Well, and just giving all credit to Bruce. And that was the beginning.
Yeah, and has your opinion about it sort of changed as you've gotten deeper and deeper into your research?
Definitely, because when I first started researching it, every time I read something that was in support of Bruce, I'm like, oh my gosh, Bruce did do this, because the letters are so strong. His letters of support, like that article giving Bruce credit. And then, other letters that, where people are writing the newspapers and mostly writing newspapers to tell them to, you need to correct this, Ada didn't do it. So you have several letters like that, and any art, there was other articles, but if you dig a little bit deeper and say, well, who wrote this article? Where did they get their information? And, even in the archives of the Goff collection in Chicago, Bruce gives a list. These are the people that know about the church. And you have, Alfonso Iannelli, who saw the church one time. You have John McCurry, who was his roommate in the 1929 and 30 during his marriage and after his marriage, who worked with him, and he had no connection to the church. Everything he knew that he would write about, he got from Bruce. You have, he referred to an Emile Fry, who was stained glass, and he says a stained glass worker. He lost the contract. Emile Fry lost the contract for the church. So he was bitter, and that's even in letters and side notes. I can't believe Emile's stirring up trouble. Why is he doing this? because he lost the bid for the stained glass in the church. And so that's not really a good reference to say, I know the truth.
Well,
when you have people that really were not involved.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate your analysis. It's so interesting,
Yeah, it's
and really you're getting into the psychology of it and
Yes.
everything else. But it's been a rare experience to talk to you today, to get an in-depth scholarly look at the history of the church from a point of view that we don't necessarily get to hear about. So I hope I can have you back as your research projects and develops and so on, and we'll want to hear again where you are at some future point. In the meantime, thank you so much for your time that you spent with us. I've been speaking to Teresa Holder.
Thank you.